All right, welcome to Stoneville, Mississippi. We're excited to be a part of the No-Till Field Day. My name's Drew Gholson. I'm Assistant Professor and Extension Irrigation Specialist here at Stoneville with Mississippi State University at the Delta Research and Extension Center. I'm here with Dave Spencer, Research Assistant and PhD candidate, and we'll both be discussing his research project here titled Runoff and Nutrient Transport when Transitioning to a Conservation Management and Furrow-Irrigated System. And what we'll be looking at here today is these management practices through tillage practices and cover cropping systems within a furrow-irrigated system, and if we can come up with practices within that we can transition and send off to growers to utilize these practices within this furrow-irrigated system. Here in the Mid-South, and specifically here in the Mississippi Delta, furrow irrigation is our dominant irrigation practice, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It's fairly flat topography, flat ground, and a lot of these fields have been landformed, and so with the really an intent not only for getting water on for furrow irrigation, but also drainage is a big issue here. And so when we talk about furrow systems and grading our fields is to help with the drainage of our fields, and so getting those beds built up for flood protection and to facilitate that flow within our furrow irrigated system. One of the issues or the concerns a lot of folks are looking at and talk about conservation tillage and cover cropping system within a furrow irrigated system is being able to use our conveyance system, which is in our furrows, as the same time is the way we're trying to apply that water. And will that hurt our advance time, hurt our irrigation uniformity as we go through that system? And so this is what this research will be looking at, and we'll show some of the results. Some of the big things we want to come from this is also beyond results is some of the issues that we saw. Be able to point out some of the issues that we've seen within this system and make sure going forward we can avoid some of those and try to narrow down what a positive or a system looks like that will increase our yields and our profitability. So one of the other reasons within furrow irrigation here is we have a fairly shallow aquifer system. Water can be cheap to pump up, and it's relatively plentiful. But one of the things we're looking for is going forward is we have a shallow aquifer system with the Mississippi River alluvial aquifer, but we are seeing declines and projections going out where we're going to have issues. And so any practices we can use to where we can increase water use efficiency within the furrow irrigation system, as well as just using less water, is going to be a plus when we're looking at this research project. The target system that most growers here in the Mississippi Delta are looking at is tillage in the fall. Get their bed formed in the fall and then plant into a stale seabed in the spring, and really being ready to plant as soon as these fields dry out and drained off in the spring. They're ready to go and being able to plant into that system. The objectives for this research project are to determine if cover crops or no-till systems improve irrigation application efficiency in corn in the Mid-South and specifically here in the Mississippi Delta, and to determine the effect of cover crops or no-till on yield, and determine the effect of cover crops or no-till systems on off-site sediment and nutrient transport. The materials and methods for this research system was no-till began in fall of 2016. Cover crops were planted in mid to late October and terminated 2 weeks prior to corn planting. The corn was planted at 32,500 seeds per acre. And as we transition from the materials and methods, I'm going to introduce Dave Spencer, and he's going to discuss his results from his research project.
Thank you, Dr. Gholson. As he mentioned, one of our primary problems in the Mississippi Delta is our dwindling irrigation water supply. And so the first result that we'd like to look at is our irrigation efficiency. No tillage was the only treatment that increased irrigation application efficiency relative to our reduced tillage no cover control, which is the regional standard. None of the cover crop treatments In any year, any of the 3 years so far of this study have improved irrigation application efficiency. When we look at the furrow advance time, which is a measure of the time that it takes for the water to reach the end of the furrows from the beginning of irrigation, from irrigation initiation, no-tillage was slowing down the waters in the furrow, so it was taking longer for that water to reach the bottom of the field, or the bottom of the plot in this case, which was directly translating to that increase in irrigation application efficiency. And that's the general thought. The longer you can keep water on the field, the longer it has to infiltrate, therefore you improve your irrigation application efficiency. Again, none of the other treatments, no other cover crop treatment or the reduced tillage with subsoiling improved furrow advance time relative to the reduced tillage no cover control. Now looking at some of the erosion metrics, no tillage again was the only treatment that improved a couple of the erosion metrics. The first one is turbidity. Turbidity is just a measure of the clarity of the liquid. It's what most people think of when they visualize, water coming off of two separate fields and holding up a jar from this field and a jar from this field. That's turbidity. It's the cloudiness of the liquid. No tillage after 1 full year in no tillage did decrease the turbidity, but it did not decrease the suspended solids. So the cereal rye cover crop did actually decrease the suspended solids. So it was actually holding more of the soil on the field relative to the reduced tillage no cover control. However, when you start looking at the nutrients, there are some issues with the no tillage. Both nitrate and orthophosphate were increased in at least 1 year in the no tillage treatment relative to the control. This is most likely due to the buildup of just a thin layer, that transport layer, all of the residue decaying, decomposing in that transport layer, and then running off, and it's never being remixed. And now we're going to look at some of the rainfall simulation results as well. That was also a part of this research. In addition to the furrow irrigation, we constructed rainfall simulators and performed one late season simulated rainfall event on each of these plots. There were no differences in runoff or efficiency of the water infiltrating into the soil across any of the treatments. The only differences that we observed were turbidity. Again, no tillage decreased turbidity relative to all of the other treatments, and total dissolved organic carbon was increased in the no tillage in the second year, so the first full year of no tillage relative to the control. And so that's just a measure of exactly what it sounds. Organic carbon dissolved in the water was greater coming off of the no tillage. And finally, for the yield results were pretty interesting. In the first year, we observed significant decreases in yield in both the Austrian winter pea and cereal rye plots, whereas in the second year there were no yield differences. And in the third year, nothing was different from the reduced tillage no cover control. However, no tillage decreased yield relative to the cover crop treatments and the reduced tillage subsoiling treatment.
So some of the things we want to talk about now are the observations and issues really that we saw throughout this research project. And hopefully as growers and producers take some of these results that we see, that they see today, can apply it onto their operation systems. And we want to make sure we're clear in some of the issues that we saw throughout this project. And conditions at planting was one. No-till from the beds you can see we had issues with bed formation from all the same issues that we talked about with formation, getting the seed up higher, getting drainage and direction of furrow irrigation without directing that water down that furrow. Tillage radish with conditions with planting, we had a difficult time with termination on tillage radish, and then a cereal rye as well.
And you're exactly right, Dr. Gholson. The cereal rye in particular was, it's very thick. When you don't get in the field to terminate it early in a timely manner when you would like to, then it's very thick. It can be difficult to plant into. However, it does hold the bed, the shape of the bed and the height of the bed much more effectively than does a system without a cover crop. You mentioned the tillage radish. The issue that we had with the tillage radish was tillage radish flowers very early in the spring. In our region of the Mississippi Delta, it typically flowered in late February of each year, which is when you would like to chemically desiccate it. However, due to the wet field conditions, we weren't able to until about April. And then you just end up with this mess of woody sticks, woody residue on your soil, on the soil surface, that can cause other issues.
Yeah, and one thing we mentioned earlier is with the current system is getting it ready to plant as soon as they can, as soon as the field dries out. And so that was one of the issues that we saw as well.
That's exactly right. And if you're having to wait to desiccate a cover crop, then when you can get in the field to spray it, instead of getting in the field and planting being your first operation, you have to kill that cover crop and then come back and plant a couple of weeks later. One of the other things that you mentioned about no-till was that we need the beds for flood protection and to get that water off of the field. We observed that in this research over the past 2 years in the no-tillage plots. Because there was no bed, we had to come back and replant all of those no-tillage plots in both years. We would plant and then receive a heavy rainfall. The soil would remain saturated, and because there wasn't that bed to lift the seed out of that saturated soil condition, the emergence was a big issue.
That's right. The beds are not just to direct the irrigation water, but we saw through this many times that getting that bed formation for other regions was important. And to wrap up this research project and our portion of this virtual field day, we'll just go over some of the highlights that we discussed and some of the main points that we saw from this research project. As far as conservation tillage, no-till, we saw reduced yields, and with that, just what Dave had mentioned earlier, with not only just directing the water down the furrow, but the importance of the formation of the bed, getting that seed bed up and planted during planting time, all played an important role of what those furrows and the importance of those furrows here in the Mississippi Delta. And you can see here beside me the stark difference between the no-till portion of this research site. Across, as far as in season, we saw increased in season dissolved nutrients, but a decrease in turbidity. As far as the cover crops go, what we saw within this research project, and as well as discussions with growers trying out cover crops as well, we saw a reduction of yield in that first year, but we did see a bounce back in those yields after that first initial year. We could alleviate some deep compaction issues, and as far as knifing in UAN, we did see issues with the cereal rye, with just how thick that was going across that. And then, like we mentioned earlier, cover crop termination, and the importance of the grower getting in and being able to plant as early as they possibly can. The management issues and timeliness of that termination is an important part. With that, we appreciate your time spending it with us today and us being a part of the virtual field day. If you have any questions on this research project or others, please feel free to contact me on the screen, and we appreciate it. Thank you.